She ran from the past every day, but a cat was waiting on the corner. The humidity of Charleston mornings had a way of clinging to everything. The Spanish moss that draped like forgotten curtains from ancient oaks, the cobblestones that gleamed with overnight dew, and especially to the skin of those who walked these streets before the sun claimed its throne. Marlene Whitford knew this intimacy well. Every morning she emerged from her cramped apartment on Meeting Street with the precision of someone who had turned avoidance into art. Her footsteps echoed against the narrow sidewalks with a rhythm born of desperation, quick, measured, purposeful, or at least they appeared purposeful to anyone who might glance her way. The truth was far more complicated. Each step was an attempt to outrun the weight she carried, a burden that had nothing to do with the humid air pressing against her shoulders and everything to do with the memories that followed her like shadows. Once, Marlene Whitford had been a name that commanded respect in Charleston's social circles. The Whitford family had owned textile mills that employed half the county. Their Georgian mansion on the Battery had hosted governors and senators, and Marlene herself had been featured in Southern Living magazine as Charleston's rising philanthropist just 3 years ago. The photograph still existed somewhere in the digital archives, Marlene in a cream-colored dress, standing in her grandmother's rose garden, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed the future held only brighter days. That woman felt like a stranger now. The financial scandal that destroyed everything had been swift and merciless. Poor investments, her husband's gambling debts, and a Ponzi scheme that her father-in-law had unknowingly funded with family money, it all collapsed within 6 months. The mansion was seized, the mills were sold to pay creditors, and the family scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Her husband had fled to his sister in Atlanta, taking their teenage daughter with him and leaving behind only divorce papers and a forwarding address that Marlene never used. Now at 43, she lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a used bookstore, worked 30 hours a week at a downtown cafe, and had exactly $247 in her checking account. The pride that had once been her shield had become her prison. She couldn't bear to ask for help, couldn't stomach the thought of her former friends, if they were ever truly friends, seeing how far she had fallen. So she walked. Every morning before work, every evening after her shift, sometimes late at night when sleep refused to come. Walking was free, and it gave her the illusion of movement even when her life felt completely still. The route was always the same. Down Meeting Street, left onto Broad, around White Point Garden where the harbor breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility, then back through the quiet residential streets where massive homes stood like monuments to the stability she had lost. It was on one of these residential streets, where Lagar Street met the tree-lined avenue that locals simply called the Row, that she first noticed him. The cat. He was sitting at the corner, as if he had an appointment, not lounging the way cats usually did, not prowling or hunting or even grooming himself, just sitting perfectly upright like a sentinel. His fur was a patchwork of grey and white, with distinctive markings that reminded Marlene of expensive marble, swirls of silver threading through patches of snow-white. But it was his eyes that caught her attention and refused to let go. They were amber, the color of honey caught in sunlight, and they seemed to look straight through her. The first time she saw him, Marlene felt a flutter of annoyance. She was trying to walk off the weight of another sleepless night, another morning of waking up to the reality that this was her life now. The last thing she needed was some stray cat blocking her path, demanding attention she couldn't afford to give. She walked past him without breaking stride, but the next morning he was there again, same spot, same posture, same unsettling amber gaze. This time, she slowed slightly, expecting him to scatter the way city cats usually did when approached by strangers. Instead, he remained perfectly still, watching her with what she could only describe as patient interest. By the third morning, Marlene found herself anticipating the corner. She told herself she was simply curious about whether the cat would be there again, but the truth was more complicated. In a life that had become predictably empty, the cat represented the only element of surprise. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. He was always there, not just occasionally, not just when it was convenient or when the weather was nice. Every single morning, no matter if it was raining or if the Charleston humidity was thick enough to cut with a knife, no matter if she was running late or if she'd changed her route slightly, somehow he was always at that corner, waiting. It was on a Thursday morning in late September, when the air finally carried the first hint of autumn and the live oaks were just beginning to whisper about seasonal change, that something shifted. Marlene had been walking for 3 weeks now with this strange, silent companion marking her daily route. She had begun to look forward to seeing him, though she would never have admitted it aloud. That particular morning, she was carrying more weight than usual. The night before, she had received an email from her daughter Emma, the first direct communication in 6 months. Emma was 17 now, a senior in high school in Atlanta, and the email was brief and businesslike. She needed Marlene to sign some forms for college applications. There was no, "How are you?" or "I miss you," or even, "I hope you're okay." Just legal necessities delivered with the cold efficiency of someone who had learned to protect herself from disappointment. Marlene had stared at that email until her eyes burned, then closed her laptop and walked to the small window that overlooked the narrow alley behind the bookstore. In the distance, she could see the spires of St. Michael's Church, where Emma had been baptized, where the family had attended services every Sunday for 15 years, where Marlene had once felt part of something larger than herself. Now she felt microscopic. She was lost in these thoughts when she reached the corner and found the cat in his usual spot. But this time something was different. Instead of his typical regal posture, he was lying down, his paws stretched out in front of him, his head tilted at an angle that suggested not just attention, but genuine concern. Marlene stopped walking. For the first time in 3 weeks, she looked directly at him, instead of just noting his presence peripherally. He was beautiful, she realized. Not in the sleek way of pampered house cats, but with the kind of dignity that comes from resilience. His fur was thick and clean despite his obvious life on the streets. His amber eyes were clear and bright, and there was something about the way he held himself that suggested intelligence. "What are you looking at?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. The cat blinked slowly. That deliberate, languid blink that cat lovers know is equivalent to a smile. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Marlene took a step closer, then another. The cat remained perfectly still, watching her approach with what seemed like encouragement. When she was close enough to touch him, she hesitated. It had been so long since she had reached out to anything, literally or figuratively. Her hands had become accustomed to staying safely at her sides, to holding nothing more precious than coffee cups and bus fare. But something about this moment felt important in a way she couldn't articulate. Maybe it was Emma's email still echoing in her mind, or maybe it was the way the morning light was catching in the cat's fur, or maybe it was simply that she was tired of being afraid of everything, including kindness. She extended her hand, palm up, fingers slightly curved. The cat studied her hand for a moment, then rose to his feet with fluid grace and stepped forward. He sniffed her fingers delicately, then pressed his head against her palm in a gesture so trusting, so gentle, that Marlene felt something crack open inside her chest. Standing there on that corner, with autumn sunlight filtering through the canopy of live oaks and a stray cat, accepting her touch as if she were worthy of trust, Marlene Whitford began to cry. Not the bitter tears of self-pity she had grown accustomed to, but something softer, something that felt like relief. And in that moment, as the cat continued to lean into her touch, a name appeared in her mind as clearly as if someone had spoken it aloud. Fennec. Not Felix or Whiskers or any of the typical cat names. Fennec. Strong, unusual, memorable. A name with weight and character. A name that suggested this was not just any cat, but someone specific. Someone important. Fennec, she said aloud, testing the sound of it. The cat looked up at her with those amber eyes, and Marlene could have sworn he approved. She stood there for several more minutes, stroking Fennec's head and marveling at how such a simple interaction could make her feel more connected to the world than she had in months. When she finally pulled her hand away, he settled back into his sitting position, but now his gaze felt less like observation and more like friendship. "I'll see you tomorrow," she found herself saying. As she walked away, Marlene felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she had forgotten it was possible: anticipation for the next day. What she didn't know was that everything was about to change. The morning routine that had once been about escape began to transform into something else entirely. For the first time since moving into the cramped apartment above Turning Page's used books, Marlene woke up with something approaching eagerness. The anticipation wasn't dramatic. She wasn't suddenly bounding out of bed with renewed purpose, but there was a subtle shift in the quality of her mornings that felt significant. Fenwick was always there, always in exactly the same spot, but now their interaction had evolved beyond her simply noting his presence. Each morning she would approach the corner with her hand already extended, and he would rise to greet her with that same gentle head press against her palm. Sometimes she would kneel down to his level, and he would allow her to scratch behind his ears or stroke the soft fur along his neck. These moments never lasted long, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, but they had become the anchor point of her day. It was on a Monday morning in early October, when the Charleston air finally carried the crisp promise of cooler weather, that Fenwick introduced the first major change to their routine. After their usual greeting, instead of settling back into his sitting position to watch her walk away, he stood up and began to walk in the same direction she was heading. Marlene paused, confused. "What are you doing?" Fenwick looked back at her with those amber eyes, then continued walking at a pace that clearly indicated she should follow. She fell into step beside him, bemused by this development. For 3 blocks they walked together in comfortable silence. Fenwick would occasionally pause to investigate interesting scents or to acknowledge other cats with subtle nods, but he never strayed far from her side. It felt surprisingly natural, like walking with an old friend who didn't need constant conversation to enjoy your company. When they reached the corner where Marlene usually turned toward the cafe, Fenwick sat down and looked up at her expectantly. "This is where I go to work," she explained, feeling slightly ridiculous for having a conversation with a cat on a public sidewalk. "I'll see you tomorrow, okay?" Fenwick remained sitting as she walked away, but when she glanced back from the cafe's front door, he was gone. That evening, when Marlene returned from her shift, she found Fenwick sitting on the narrow front step of the bookstore, directly beneath her apartment's entrance. Her heart did something complicated at the sight of him. Part surprise, part delight, part anxiety. Having Fenwick appear at the corner each morning was one thing. It felt contained, scheduled, manageable. But having him show up at her actual home felt like a significant escalation, one she wasn't sure she was prepared for. "How did you know where I live?" she asked, then immediately felt foolish for expecting an answer. Fenwick stood up and walked to her, weaving between her legs in the figure-8 pattern that cat owners recognize as the highest form of feline affection. The sensation was startling. When was the last time any living thing had initiated physical contact with her? When was the last time she had been greeted with enthusiasm by anyone or anything? "I can't take you upstairs," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The lease says no pets without a deposit, and I can't afford—" She trailed off, realizing that she was making excuses to a cat. Fenwick sat down and began grooming his front paw with the kind of patient concentration that suggested he was prepared to wait indefinitely. Marlene stood there for several minutes, keys in hand, staring down at this beautiful, persistent creature who had somehow decided that she was worth following home. The rational part of her mind recited all the reasons this was a bad idea. The pet deposit she couldn't afford, the responsibility she wasn't ready for, the risk of caring about something that could be taken away. But there was another voice, quieter but more insistent, that whispered, "When was the last time anything chose you?" "Just for tonight," she heard herself saying. "Just until I figure out what to do." She unlocked the door and held it open. Fenwick walked past her with the dignity of someone who had never doubted he would be invited in. Marlene's apartment was spartanly furnished, a necessity born of both limited finances and the psychological burden of owning too many things that could be lost. There was a small couch she'd bought at Goodwill, a coffee table made from a repurposed door and concrete blocks, a few dishes and cookware basics, and very little else. The walls were bare except for a single photograph. Emma, at age 12, grinning gap-toothed in her soccer uniform, holding a trophy almost as big as she was. Fenwick explored the space methodically, sniffing corners and investigating the few pieces of furniture with the thoroughness of a prospective tenant. When he completed his circuit, he jumped onto the couch, kneaded the cushions for a few seconds, then settled into a comfortable loaf position. "Make yourself at home," Marlene said dryly. For the first time in months, she heard herself laugh. That night, as Marlene lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of the city settling into sleep, she became aware of something she had almost forgotten existed, the soft, rhythmic sound of another breathing presence in her space. It was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant she wasn't alone, terrifying because it meant she had something to lose again. The next morning, Fenwick was gone. Marlene woke up to find the couch empty and the front door still locked. For a moment she wondered if she had dreamed the entire evening, but then she noticed the small indentation in the couch cushion where Fenwick had slept, and she found a few grey and white hairs on the fabric. When she reached their usual corner, Fenwick was there, sitting in his customary spot as if nothing had changed. "Where did you go?" she asked, but he simply blinked slowly and allowed her to pet him before beginning their walk together. This became the new pattern. Fenwick would spend part of the day with her, sometimes just the morning walk, sometimes appearing at her apartment in the evening, occasionally both. He seemed to understand instinctively when she needed company and when she needed space. He never demanded attention, but was always available when she reached for him. It was during one of these evening visits that Marlene realized she had begun talking to him. Not just the brief pleasantries she offered during their morning encounters, but actual conversation. She found herself describing her day at the cafe, complaining about difficult customers, sharing small observations about the changing weather or the people she saw on her walks. Fenwick would listen with the kind of focused attention that most humans couldn't manage, occasionally responding with soft chirps or purrs that felt remarkably like conversational responses. "You're a good listener," she told him one evening as he sprawled across her lap while she sat on the couch. "Better than most people I know." The words hung in the air, highlighting a truth she had been avoiding. She didn't really know many people anymore. The social circle that had once defined her identity had evaporated along with her financial security. Former friends had stopped calling, invitations had dried up, and she had been too proud and too ashamed to maintain any of those relationships herself. But with Fenwick, none of that mattered. He didn't know about her past wealth or her current struggles. He didn't judge her for her small apartment or her second-hand clothes. He simply accepted her as she was in this moment, and somehow that acceptance began to feel like enough. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in mid-October. Marlene was attempting to cook dinner, something she rarely bothered with anymore, usually settling for whatever leftovers the cafe would let her take home. But something about Fenwick's presence made the apartment feel more like a home, and homes were places where people cooked actual meals. She was standing at the tiny stove, stirring a pot of pasta sauce that smelled like her grandmother's recipe, when Fenwick began weaving between her legs in that figure-8 pattern again. The movement was hypnotic and affectionate, but it was also making it difficult to navigate the small kitchen space safely. "Fenwick, you're going to trip me," she said, stepping carefully around him. But instead of moving away, he sat down directly in front of the stove and looked up at her with an expression that seemed to say, "This smells wonderful, and I approve of this development." "You like that I'm cooking?" she asked. He chirped softly, a sound she had learned meant yes in Fenwick's vocabulary. "When's the last time I cooked a real meal?" she continued, stirring the sauce thoughtfully. "I used to cook all the time. I had this beautiful kitchen with a gas range and granite countertops, and I would make elaborate dinners for Emma and David. Sunday roasts, holiday meals, birthday cakes from scratch." Her voice trailed off as the memories threatened to overwhelm her, but instead of the usual sharp pain, she felt something softer. Nostalgia tinged with loss, but not the devastating grief that had been her constant companion for so long. "I was good at it," she said quietly. "I was really good at making a home." Fenwick purred, a low, steady rumble that seemed to say he believed her. That night, as they shared the simple pasta dinner, Marlene on the couch with a proper plate, Fenwick beside her with small pieces of plain chicken she had cooked separately, she realized something had shifted. For the first time since losing everything, she had created something positive. She had made a meal, shared it with a companion, and felt proud of the result. It was a small thing, almost absurdly small in the context of everything she had lost, but it was hers. She had chosen to cook, chosen to share, chosen to make this moment matter, and Fenwick, with his patient presence and unconditional acceptance, had made it possible for her to choose at all. Over the following days, other small changes began to manifest. Marlene started buying real groceries instead of just surviving on cafe leftovers. She began straightening up the apartment each morning, not because anyone would see it, but because it felt good to create order. She even bought a small plant, a resilient jade succulent that promised to thrive despite minimal care, and placed it on the windowsill where both she and Fenwick could enjoy watching it grow. But the most significant change was harder to quantify. Something in her posture had shifted. She still walked quickly during her morning routes, but it was no longer the desperate pace of someone trying to escape. Now it felt more like purpose. She was walking towards something instead of away from it. She had no idea that Fenwick was about to introduce her to what that something might be. It started with Mrs. Chen. Mrs. Chen was an elderly woman who lived 2 blocks from Marlene's apartment in a narrow townhouse that had been in her family for 3 generations. Marlene had noticed her before. It was impossible not to notice Mrs. Chen, who maintained the most spectacular container garden Marlene had ever seen, despite being well into her 70s. The front steps and sidewalk in front of her house bloomed year-round, with an ever-changing display of seasonal flowers and herbs. On this particular morning, as Marlene and Fenwick made their usual walk together, they found Mrs. Chen struggling with several heavy grocery bags that had torn open, spilling their contents across the sidewalk. Marlene's first instinct was to look away and walk past quickly. Getting involved in other people's problems was a luxury she couldn't afford, and besides, surely someone else would help. Someone more capable, someone with fewer problems of their own. But as they drew closer to the scene, Fenwick suddenly sat down. Not his usual graceful settling, but an abrupt stop that clearly indicated he was not moving another step. When Marlene tried to encourage him forward, he looked up at her with those amber eyes, and then looked pointedly at Mrs. Chen, who was now on her hands and knees trying to collect scattered oranges. "Fenwick, we can't," Marlene whispered. "I don't even know her." But Fenwick remained immobile, his gaze alternating between Marlene and the struggling woman, until the silence became more compelling than any argument. Marlene took a deep breath and approached. "Excuse me, can I help you with that?" Mrs. Chen looked up, her face flushed with embarrassment and exertion. "Oh, you don't need to. These bags weren't as strong as they used to be." "Here, let me get the oranges," Marlene said, already kneeling to gather the scattered fruit. "Do you have another bag?" "Inside, yes, but I don't want to be a bother." "It's no bother at all," Marlene found herself saying, though part of her mind was screaming that this was exactly the kind of involvement she had been trying to avoid. Together they collected the spilled groceries and got everything safely inside. Mrs. Chen insisted on making tea, and before Marlene quite knew how it had happened, she was sitting in a bright kitchen filled with the scent of jasmine and ginger, with Fenwick purring on her lap and Mrs. Chen bustling around with the efficiency of someone half her age. "Your cat has excellent manners," Mrs. Chen observed, setting a delicate porcelain cup in front of Marlene. "He's not actually my cat," Marlene started to say, then stopped. The words felt false. "I mean, he is, but it's complicated." Mrs. Chen smiled. "The best relationships usually are. I'm Chen Wei-ming, by the way, but everyone calls me Mrs. Chen. Marlene Whitford." "Ah, you live above the bookstore on Meeting Street. I've seen you walking." Marlene tensed, expecting judgment or prying questions about her circumstances, but Mrs. Chen simply continued serving tea with the casual ease of someone making conversation with an old friend. "Fenwick is very handsome," Mrs. Chen continued, scratching behind his ears. "Very intelligent eyes. He reminds me of a cat I had when I was young in Taiwan. That cat also had a gift for bringing people together." They talked for nearly an hour, about gardening, about the changing neighborhood, about the weather and the best places to buy fresh vegetables. It was the longest conversation Marlene had had with anyone besides cafe customers in months, and she was surprised by how natural it felt. As she was preparing to leave, Mrs. Chen placed a gentle hand on her arm. "We're having a potluck dinner at the community center this Saturday. Just neighbors getting together, sharing food. You should come. You could bring something you like to cook." Marlene's immediate instinct was to decline politely. She didn't do social gatherings anymore. She didn't have anything to contribute. She couldn't afford to buy ingredients for a dish that would feed a crowd. But then she looked down at Fenwick, who was regarding her with that patient, encouraging expression, and she heard herself saying, "Maybe I could make cornbread. I have my grandmother's recipe." "Perfect," Mrs. Chen beamed. 6 o'clock on Saturday. And bring Fenwick if you'd like. The community center allows well-behaved pets for our gatherings." Walking home, Marlene felt something she hadn't experienced in so long she had almost forgotten its name. Anticipation mixed with nervousness. The good kind of nervousness. The kind that meant something mattered. That evening she sat on her couch with Fenwick curled beside her, looking through her grandmother's recipe box, one of the few personal items she had been able to keep when everything else was sold or seized. The cornbread recipe was written on a card yellowed with age, in her grandmother's careful handwriting that had always made grocery lists look like poetry. "What do you think?" she asked Fenwick. "Can I do this?" He looked up at her and purred, and somehow that simple sound felt like the most confident yes she had heard in years. Saturday was still 4 days away, but for the first time since losing everything, Marlene Whitford was looking forward to something. She had no idea that the potluck dinner would introduce her to a community she never knew she was missing, or that Fenwick's influence on her life was just beginning. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect October weather that made Charleston feel like a postcard. The temperature had dropped just enough to hint at autumn without requiring more than a light cardigan, and the humidity that usually pressed against the city like a wet blanket had lifted, leaving the air crisp and welcoming. Marlene stood in her small kitchen, staring at the pan of cornbread cooling on her counter. She had made it 3 times that week, throwing away the first 2 attempts. The first had been too dry. She had forgotten how much butter her grandmother's recipe required. The second had been perfect in texture, but tasted flat because she had been too nervous about the expense to add the honey that made all the difference. This third attempt looked and smelled exactly like her grandmother's cornbread, golden brown with slightly darker edges, with that distinctive aroma that meant home to anyone who had grown up in the South. But now, with less than an hour until the potluck, Marlene was paralyzed by second thoughts. What was she doing? She hadn't been to a social gathering in over a year. She didn't know how to make small talk with strangers anymore. What if people asked about her work, her family, her past? What if someone recognized her name and remembered the scandal? What if they were all perfectly nice people who would pity her once they realized she was the broke woman from the apartment above the used bookstore? "I can't do this," she said aloud. Fenwick, who had been napping on the windowsill, opened his eyes and looked at her with mild interest. "I'll just stay home," she continued, pacing the small space between her kitchen and living room. "I'll make up an excuse. I'll say I got sick or had to work or—" Fenwick jumped down from the windowsill and walked to where she had set the cornbread. He stood on his hind legs, placed his front paws on the counter and sniffed delicately at the pan. Then he looked back at Marlene and chirped, a soft, encouraging sound. "You think it's good?" she asked. He chirped again, more insistently this time, then walked to the front door and sat down, looking at her expectantly. "You want to go?" Fenwick meowed, not a chirp this time, but a proper meow that clearly meant, "Yes, and we're going to be late if you don't stop overthinking this." Despite her anxiety, Marlene smiled. "Okay, but if this is terrible, I'm blaming you." The Charleston Community Center was a modest brick building that had been serving the neighborhood for 40 years. It sat between a hardware store and a flower shop on a tree-lined street that Marlene walked past regularly, but had never really noticed. Tonight, warm light spilled from its windows, and she could hear the gentle murmur of conversation and laughter, even from the sidewalk. Marlene stood at the entrance, cornbread in hand, and Fenwick at her feet on a leash she had bought that afternoon, trying to summon the courage to go inside. The door opened as she was still gathering her nerve, and Mrs. Chen appeared. "Marlene, I was hoping you would come." Mrs. Chen's smile was genuinely warm, with no trace of the polite insincerity that Marlene had become expert at detecting. "And you brought Fenwick. How wonderful. I hope it's really okay that he's here," Marlene said. "I can take him home if—" "Nonsense. Several people brought their dogs, and there's a cat named Princess who belongs to the Johnsons. Come in, come in." The community center's main room had been transformed for the gathering. Long tables held an impressive array of dishes, casseroles, salads, desserts, and breads that made Marlene's single pan of cornbread seem inadequate. But Mrs. Chen ushered her directly to the food table and made space for her contribution with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for much grander offerings. "Everyone," Mrs. Chen called out, "this is Marlene and Fenwick, our new neighbors." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Marlene found herself surrounded by friendly faces and welcoming voices, people introducing themselves and their own pets, complimenting Fenwick's unusual markings and her cornbread before they had even tasted it. She had expected to feel exposed and uncomfortable, but instead found herself thinking, when was the last time I was welcomed anywhere? The evening passed in a blur of conversations that were easier than she had anticipated. There was James, a retired teacher, who had started a neighborhood book club that met at turning pages. Sarah, a young mother who ran a food blog and was fascinated by Marlene's grandmother's cornbread recipe. The Johnsons, an elderly couple whose cat Princess immediately established a polite but firm hierarchy with Fenwick. Maria, who worked at the animal shelter and was thrilled to meet such a well-socialized former stray. "Former stray?" Marlene asked. "Oh yes," Maria said, scratching Fenwick behind the ears while he purred with shameless enthusiasm. "You can always tell. He's got that confident independence that comes from having survived on his own, but he's also clearly bonded with you. That's not always easy to achieve with cats who've been on the streets. How can you tell he was a stray? Lots of little signs. The way he checks every corner when he enters a new space. He did a complete perimeter of this room before settling down. The way he's positioned himself so he can see all the exits. And see how he's keeping track of where you are at all times? That's attachment behavior, but it's also protective. He's watching out for both of you." Marlene looked down at Fenwick, who was indeed oriented so that he could see both her and the room's main entrance. "I had no idea. Cats like Fenwick make the best companions," Maria continued. "They choose their humans very deliberately. The fact that he picked you says something special about both of you." As the evening wound down and people began packing up leftover food, Sarah approached Marlene with a covered dish. "I brought way too much lasagna," she said. "Would you do me a favor and take some home? It freezes well if you can't eat it all this week." Marlene's pride flared instinctively. She didn't need charity, didn't want to be seen as someone who required leftovers. But then she looked at Sarah's face and saw not pity, but genuine friendliness, the kind of gesture that was more about connection than need. "That's very kind of you," she said. "Thank you." Walking home with Fenwick trotting beside her and a container of homemade lasagna in her free hand, Marlene felt something she had almost forgotten was possible, the satisfaction of belonging somewhere. "That wasn't so terrible, was it?" she asked Fenwick. He chirped his agreement, then stopped suddenly at a familiar corner. Their corner, where this whole journey had started. "What is it?" she asked. Fenwick was looking across the street at a small group of people gathered around a car with a flat tire. Even in the dim streetlight, Marlene could see it was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived alone and often struggled with heavy grocery bags. She was standing helplessly beside her car while two teenagers attempted to change the tire, clearly having no more idea what they were doing than she did. Marlene's first instinct was to keep walking. She had already pushed herself enough for one evening. She had her own problems to worry about. She couldn't solve everyone else's difficulties too, but Fenwick sat down, using the same deliberate stillness that had gotten her to help Mrs. Chen with her groceries. "Fenwick, no," she said quietly. "We did enough good deeds for one day." He looked up at her with those amber eyes, then back at the group across the street, then back at her. The message was clear. This is what we do now. This is who we are. Marlene sighed. "You're going to make me a better person whether I like it or not, aren't you?" She crossed the street. 20 minutes later, with the help of a proper jack borrowed from the hardware store's after-hours emergency kit and some instructions from a YouTube video on her phone, Mrs. Patterson's car was roadworthy again. The teenagers, who turned out to be her great-nephews visiting from Somerville, were effusive in their gratitude, and Mrs. Patterson pressed Marlene's hands between her own with the kind of warmth that made the October evening feel like summer. "You're an angel," Mrs. Patterson said. "How can I ever thank you?" "It was nothing," Marlene replied, but even as she said it, she knew that wasn't true. It had been something. She had seen a problem and solved it. She had used skills she didn't even remember having. When was the last time she had changed a tire to help someone who needed it? She had been useful. She had mattered. Walking home for the second time that evening, Marlene realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with the world. For months, she had moved through Charleston like a ghost, trying to be invisible, trying not to take up space or require attention. But tonight she had been present. She had contributed. She had been seen and appreciated, not for who she used to be, but for what she could offer right now, in this moment, as herself. "Is this your plan?" she asked Fenwick as they climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment. "You're going to keep putting me in situations where I have to help people?" Fenwick paused on the landing and looked up at her with an expression that seemed to say, "Is that such a terrible thing?" It wasn't, she realized. For the first time in over a year, helping others hadn't felt like a burden or an obligation. It had felt like remembering who she was capable of being. Over the following weeks, Marlene's world began to expand in ways she hadn't anticipated. Sarah invited her to join the food blog's recipe testing group. which met monthly in different kitchens around the neighborhood. James asked if she would be interested in helping with the book club discussions at Turning Pages, since she clearly had insights to offer about literature. Maria mentioned that the animal shelter could always use volunteers, especially people who understood cats, as well as Marlene obviously did. Each invitation felt like a small miracle, not because they were extraordinary opportunities, but because they were ordinary ones, the kind of normal social connections that she had taken for granted in her previous life and now recognized as precious gifts. But it was Fennec who continued to orchestrate the most meaningful encounters. There was the morning when he led her 3 blocks out of their usual route to where a lost dog was cowering behind a dumpster, too frightened to approach the family calling for him. Fennec somehow communicated to the dog that Marlene could be trusted, and within minutes she was reuniting a frantic 8-year-old girl with her missing beagle. There was the afternoon when he insisted on following an elderly man who was clearly struggling to carry his groceries, leading them to discover that Mr. Rodriguez had fallen the day before and was too proud to ask for help. Marlene ended up not only carrying his groceries, but also organizing an informal neighborhood support network for elderly residents who lived alone. There was the evening when Fennec's persistent meowing led her to investigate a strange sound in the alley behind her building, where she found a mother cat with newborn kittens who had taken shelter in a cardboard box. By the time Maria arrived with supplies from the animal shelter, Marlene had already named all 4 kittens and was researching the best ways to help feral cats transition to domestic life. "You know," Maria said as they watched the mother cat carefully accept food from Marlene's hand, "we could really use someone like you at the shelter, someone who understands that every animal has a story, and that sometimes they just need the right person to help them write the next chapter." The volunteer application was on Marlene's kitchen table for 3 days before she finally filled it out. Not because she didn't want to help, but because accepting the position would mean admitting that this was her life now, not a temporary situation while she figured out how to get back to who she used to be, but her actual real existence. It was Fennec who made the decision for her. She found him sitting on the application one morning, grooming himself with the deliberate concentration of someone who had no intention of moving. When she tried to slide the paper out from under him, he simply rearranged himself so that he was covering even more of it. "Subtle," she told him. He chirped and continued grooming, completely unbothered by her sarcasm. That afternoon, she dropped off the completed application at the Charleston Animal Shelter, and within a week she was spending Saturday mornings helping to socialize cats who were preparing for adoption. It was volunteer work, unpaid, but it felt more valuable than any job she had ever held. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no moment of epiphany, no sudden realization that everything was going to be okay. Instead, it was gradual and subtle, like the way autumn changes into winter in the South, barely perceptible day by day, but undeniable when you looked back over time. Marlene began to notice that she was sleeping better. The insomnia that had plagued her since losing everything didn't disappear entirely, but now when she lay awake at night, her mind was more likely to be planning the next day's activities than rehearsing past failures. She was eating better too, not just because Fennec's presence made cooking feel worthwhile, but because she was being invited to share meals with other people regularly enough that proper nutrition had become a social activity rather than a solitary chore. Most significantly, she was laughing again, real laughter, not the bitter, hollow sound that had passed for humor during her darkest months. She laughed when Fennec tried to steal her favorite spot on the couch and ended up trapped under a throw pillow. She laughed when Mr. Rodriguez told stories about his youth in Puerto Rico while she helped him organize his medications. She laughed when Sarah's toddler tried to feed cornbread to Princess the cat and ended up wearing more of it than the cat ate. But it was the phone call that changed everything. It came on a Thursday evening in early November, just as Marlene was settling in for the night with a cup of tea and a book James had recommended. Fennec was curled in her lap, purring steadily, and she was thinking that this might be the most contentment she had felt in years. When her phone rang and she saw Emma Mobile on the screen, her heart stopped. Emma never called. Emma texted occasionally, brief and businesslike communications about practical matters. But phone calls were too intimate, too risky, too much like the relationship they used to have before everything fell apart. "Hello?" Marlene's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Mom?" Emma's voice sounded strange, not angry or distant as it had been for so long, but uncertain. Young, Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. Are you okay? Yeah, I was on Instagram and I saw something weird. Sarah Martinez, from my old school. Her mom posted this picture from some neighborhood thing and you're in it. You and a cat. Marlene's mind raced. Sarah from the food blog must have posted photos from the potluck dinner. Oh, yes, I've been going to some community events. You look happy, Emma said, and there was something in her voice that Marlene couldn't identify. I haven't seen you look happy in a long time. Tears sprang to Marlene's eyes so suddenly she couldn't speak. Mom, are you there? I'm here, Marlene managed. I didn't know you looked at pictures of me anymore. Of course I do. I miss you. Things got so complicated, and Dad said you needed space to figure things out, and I didn't know what to say or how to help. Oh, Emma, Marlene's voice broke. I miss you too. Every day. I didn't know you wanted to talk to me. I always want to talk to you. I just didn't know if you wanted to talk to me. They talked for 2 hours. About school, about Emma's college applications, about the friends she was missing, and the teachers she liked, and the boy she thought might ask her to winter formal. About Fenwick, who Emma was fascinated by and insisted on seeing through video chat. About the volunteer work and the book club and the way Charleston was changing with the seasons. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. When they finally hung up, Marlene sat in her quiet apartment feeling as if the world had rearranged itself around her. Emma wanted to visit for Thanksgiving. She wanted to meet Fenwick in person. She wanted to see where Marlene lived now, wanted to hear more about her volunteer work, wanted to understand this new life her mother was building. She wants to come home, Marlene told Fenwick, who was watching her with those wise amber eyes. Except this isn't really home, is it? This is just where I've been hiding. But even as she said it, she realized it wasn't true. This small apartment, this neighborhood, these people who had welcomed her, this had become home. Not the grand, impressive home she had once maintained for show, but a real home. A place where she belonged, where she was needed, where she could be herself without pretense or apology. That night she called Emma back. What would you think about spending Christmas here too? She asked. I know it's not what you're used to, but I could introduce you to everyone, and we could volunteer together at the animal shelter, and Mrs. Chen makes these amazing dumplings. Mom, Emma interrupted, and Marlene's heart clenched, preparing for disappointment. I would love that, Emma continued. I would absolutely love that. After they hung up, Marlene sat on her couch with Fenwick purring against her shoulder, looking around the small space that had once felt like exile and now felt like possibility. In 6 weeks, her daughter would be here. Emma would meet Fenwick and Mrs. Chen and Sarah and all the other people who had become part of Marlene's new life. She would see that her mother hadn't just survived the loss of everything. She had learned to build something better from what remained. But first, there was Thanksgiving to navigate. 3 days away, and Marlene suddenly realized she was nervous about something entirely new. She was afraid she might not be strong enough yet for what was coming. She had no idea that her greatest test was still ahead. Thanksgiving week arrived with an unexpected cold snap that sent Charlestonians scrambling for sweaters they hadn't worn since the previous winter. Marlene spent Monday morning at the animal shelter, helping to prepare the cats for a holiday adoption event, her hands busy with feeding and grooming, while her mind raced with anticipation about Emma's visit. Emma would arrive Wednesday afternoon and stay through the weekend, 4 days that felt simultaneously too long and not nearly long enough. Marlene had cleaned her small apartment until it sparkled, stocked the refrigerator with Emma's favorite foods, and planned a dozen activities that she hoped would show her daughter the richness of this new life she had built. You're nervous, Maria observed, as Marlene meticulously organized the same supply cabinet for the 3rd time that morning. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's watched you handle actual crises with complete calm, Maria said gently. What's the worst thing that could happen? Marlene paused, considering. That she'll see how small my life has become and feel sorry for me, or that she'll realize I'm happier now than I was before and feel guilty about everything we lost, or that she'll decide she prefers the version of me that existed when we had money. Or, Maria suggested, she might see that her mother has learned to build a meaningful life from whatever materials she had available and feel proud. That afternoon, Marlene walked home with Fenwick trotting beside her, trying to hold on to Maria's optimism. But as they approached their building, she saw something that made her heart drop. An official-looking notice taped to the front door. With shaking hands, she read the document. The building had been sold. The new owners were converting it to condominiums. All residential tenants had 60 days to vacate. 60 days. Emma was arriving tomorrow, and Marlene had just learned she was losing her home. She sat down hard on the front steps, Fenwick immediately climbing into her lap with the kind of purposeful comfort he offered during her worst moments. The irony was almost laughable. Just when she had finally stopped running from her past, just when she had built something stable and meaningful, the universe was forcing her to start over again. "What am I going to do?" she whispered into Fenwick's fur. The apartment had been all she could afford after losing everything, and rental prices in Charleston had only gone up since she had signed her lease. Even with her job at the cafe and the small amount she earned from occasional freelance bookkeeping, she couldn't afford anything larger or nicer, and most landlords in the area had no pets policies that would mean giving up Fenwick, something she couldn't even consider anymore. That night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emma arriving to find her mother homeless, or worse, having to explain why the cat who had become central to both their phone conversations was no longer part of the picture. By morning, she had worked herself into a state of barely controlled panic. Emma's bus arrived at 2:17 p.m. Wednesday afternoon. Marlene stood on the platform, watching passengers disembark, and when she saw her daughter, taller than she remembered, with hair she had cut stylishly short and an expression of nervous excitement, her heart did something complicated. "Mom!" Emma dropped her duffel bag and hugged Marlene with the enthusiasm of someone who had forgotten to be cautious about affection. "You look so grown up," Marlene said, meaning it. "You look different too," Emma replied, stepping back to study her mother's face. "Calmer, I think. And where's Fenwick? I've been dying to meet him." "He's at home," Marlene said, picking up Emma's bag and trying to keep her voice steady. "He's been very excited about meeting you too." The walk from the bus station to the apartment had never felt longer. Marlene pointed out landmarks: the cafe where she worked, the community center where she had met so many neighbors, the corner where she had first encountered Fenwick, but every step brought them closer to the conversation she dreaded having. Fenwick was waiting at the apartment door, sitting with the same patient dignity he had displayed that first morning on the corner. When Emma knelt down to greet him, he approached slowly, sniffed her hand delicately, then bumped his head against her palm in unmistakable acceptance. "He's perfect," Emma breathed, looking up at Marlene with shining eyes. "Mom, he's absolutely perfect, and he clearly adores you." For the next few hours, Marlene was able to forget about the eviction notice. Emma was enchanted by the small apartment, exclaiming over details that Marlene had dismissed as evidence of her reduced circumstances. She loved the view from the window, the cozy efficiency of the kitchen, the way Fenwick had claimed the best spot on the couch and arranged his toys in strategic locations throughout the space. "It feels like a real home," Emma said, as they prepared dinner together, Fenwick supervising from his perch on the counter. "Our old house was beautiful, but it always felt like a museum, like we weren't supposed to actually live there, just maintain it." "You don't miss it?" Marlene asked. Emma considered this seriously. "I miss some things. I miss my bedroom and the way the garden looked in spring, but mostly I missed you. The last couple of years before everything happened, you were always so stressed about maintaining everything perfectly. You seemed more worried about the house than about us." The observation stung because it was accurate. Marlene had become so invested in preserving their lifestyle that she had lost sight of what actually mattered within it. They were settling down to watch a movie after dinner when Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and frowned. "What is it?" Marlene asked. "Dad's being weird. He keeps asking if I'm okay, if you seem stable, if I need him to come get me early." Emma looked up, confused. "He's acting like he thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown. Why would he think that?" Marlene's stomach clenched. She had been dreading this conversation, but there was no avoiding it now. "Emma, I need to tell you something." She explained about the eviction notice, trying to keep her voice calm and matter-of-fact. She talked about rental prices and pet policies, and the practical challenges of finding new housing on short notice. She did not mention the panic that had kept her awake all night, or the way she had stood in the shower that morning, crying silently so Emma wouldn't hear. Emma listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. So you have to move out by January? She asked when Marlene finished. Yes. And you don't know where you'll go? I'm working on it. I have some options. This was not entirely true, but Emma didn't need to carry her mother's anxiety. What about Fenwick? What about him? Dad's going to say you can't keep him. He's going to say this proves you can't handle responsibility, that you're making emotional decisions instead of practical ones. Marlene felt something cold settle in her chest. Emma was right. David would absolutely use this situation as evidence that she was unstable, irresponsible, unfit to make decisions about their daughter's life. I'm not giving up Fenwick, Marlene said quietly. Good, Emma replied firmly, because if you did, I would never forgive you. The directness of the statement surprised them both. Emma, Mom, do you know what you sounded like on the phone these past few weeks? You sounded like yourself again. Like the mom I remember from before things got so complicated, and every story you told me involved Fenwick somehow. He's not just your pet. He's part of who you're becoming. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep on the couch with Fenwick curled against her feet, Marlene lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to solve an impossible equation. She needed a place that would accept pets, that she could afford, that wouldn't require her to give up the job and community connections that had become essential to her well-being. Thursday morning brought more complications. Emma woke up with a fever and a sore throat that made swallowing difficult. It wasn't serious, just a typical winter bug, but it meant cancelling their planned visit to the animal shelter and spending the day in quiet recovery instead. I'm sorry, Emma croaked from the couch, surrounded by tissues and looking miserable. I was so excited to see where you volunteer. Don't apologize, Marlene said, bringing her tea with honey. We have other days. But privately, she was calculating. If Emma was sick, David would want her to come home early. If Emma went home early, she would tell him about the eviction situation. If David found out that Marlene was losing her housing and didn't have a clear plan for what came next, he would argue that Emma shouldn't visit again until Marlene's life was more stable. The thought of months or even years passing before seeing Emma again was unbearable. Friday morning brought the crisis to a head. Emma was feeling better, but her phone had been buzzing constantly with increasingly concerned texts from her father. Finally, she answered one of his calls, and Marlene could hear David's voice through the speaker. Not the words, but the tone of someone who had already made up his mind about something. When Emma hung up, her expression was grim. He wants me to come home today instead of Sunday, she said. He's worried about me getting sicker, and he says you probably can't afford to take me to a doctor if I need one. The accuracy of that last point was devastating. He's not wrong, Marlene admitted. I have insurance through the cafe, but it's pretty basic. That's not the point, Mum. The point is that he's looking for reasons to keep us apart, and now he's found one. They spent Friday afternoon walking through the neighborhood, with Emma meeting Mrs. Chen and Sarah, and some of the other people who had become important to Marlene's life. Everyone was charmed by Emma, and Emma seemed genuinely interested in hearing about their connections with her mother. But the shadow of the eviction notice and David's concerns hung over everything. That evening, as they packed Emma's things for her early departure the next morning, Emma asked the question that Marlene had been dreading. What if you can't find a place that takes cats? I'll find something, Marlene said, though she had no idea what. Promise me you won't give up Fenwick just to make things easier. Marlene looked across the room at Fenwick, who was sitting in his favorite spot, watching them with those amber eyes that had first stopped her in her tracks months ago. He had been the catalyst for every positive change in her life since losing everything. Through him, she had rediscovered her capacity for love, for service, for connection with other people. The idea of losing him felt like contemplating voluntary amputation. I promise, she said. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered how she would keep that promise if it came down to choosing between having a home and keeping Fenwick. Saturday morning, Marlene walked Emma to the bus station with Fenwick on his leash, all three of them subdued by the knowledge that they didn't know when they would see each other again. Call me as soon as you know something about housing, Emma said as her bus prepared to board. I will. And send me pictures of apartments before you decide on anything. I want to make sure Fenwick will be happy there too. I will, Marlene repeated, though she suspected there wouldn't be many options to choose from. Emma hugged them both, Marlene fiercely, Fenwick gently, then disappeared into the bus. Walking home alone, Marlene felt the full weight of her situation settling over her like a lead blanket. In 6 weeks, she would be homeless unless she could find a miracle. She had less than $500 in savings, no family to turn to for help, and a responsibility to a cat who had saved her life in every way that mattered. For the first time since that morning on the corner, when Fenwick had first allowed her to touch him, Marlene Whitford felt completely hopeless. She had no idea that her salvation was about to come from the most unexpected source imaginable. The weekend after Emma's departure passed in a blur of apartment hunting and crushing disappointment. Marlene spent Saturday morning calling every rental listing in her price range, only to hear the same phrase repeated, "No pets allowed." By Sunday afternoon, she had expanded her search to include places that would require an hour-long commute to work, but even those few options evaporated when landlords learned about Fenwick. Monday morning at the animal shelter, Marlene tried to focus on her volunteer duties, but Maria noticed her distraction immediately. "Any luck with housing?" Maria asked as they cleaned the cat kennels together. "Not exactly." Marlene's voice was flat with exhaustion. "I'm starting to think I might need to find Fenwick a new home before I become homeless myself." "Absolutely not," Maria said so sharply that several cats looked up from their morning naps. "I'm sorry, but no. That cat chose you for a reason, and you two are not getting separated on my watch. Maria, I can't live on the streets with a cat." "You're not going to live on the streets, period. Give me a few days to make some calls, okay? There are resources for situations like this." But Marlene had already begun the painful process of mentally preparing to give up Fenwick. That evening, she sat on her couch with him purring in her lap, trying to memorize the weight of him, the texture of his fur, the particular way he chirped when he wanted attention. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into his fur. "I tried to build something stable for both of us, and I failed." Fenwick looked up at her with those amber eyes, then did something he had never done before. He reached up and gently patted her face with his paw, as if he were trying to comfort her. The gesture broke her heart. Tuesday brought an unexpected phone call. "Marlene, this is James from the book club. I hope you don't mind that Sarah gave me your number." "Of course not." "What's up?" "Well, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine about your housing situation, and I wanted to talk to you about something. Would you be free to meet for coffee this afternoon?" They met at the cafe where Marlene worked during her break between shifts. James arrived with a folder of papers and an expression that was both serious and oddly excited. "I have a proposition for you," he said without preamble, "but I want you to hear me out before you say no." "Okay," Marlene said cautiously. "My mother passed away 6 months ago and I inherited her house on Sullivan's Island. It's been sitting empty because I can't bear to sell it, but I also can't afford to maintain 2 properties indefinitely. The house needs someone living in it, not just for security but for upkeep, and I need someone I can trust, someone who understands that a home requires care, not just occupancy." He slid a photograph across the table. It showed a modest cottage with weathered blue shutters, surrounded by mature live oaks and native plants. There was a wide front porch with a swing, and Marlene could see glimpses of the ocean through the trees. "James, I can't afford to rent a house on Sullivan's Island. That's way out of my budget." "That's not what I'm proposing. I'm proposing a caretaker arrangement. You would live there rent-free in exchange for basic maintenance, keeping the yard tidy, making sure the house stays aired out and lived in, handling small repairs or calling me for larger ones. You'd pay your own utilities, but the house has solar panels that cover most of the electricity, and the water bill is minimal." Marlene stared at the photograph. "Why me?" "Because in the 6 months I've known you, I've watched you take better care of this community than most people take care of their own families, because you understand what it means to lose a home and appreciate what it means to have one. And because my mother was a cat lover who always said that houses are happier when they have cats living in them." "James, this is incredibly generous, but there's one condition," he continued. "The arrangement is year to year, renewable by mutual agreement. If you want to build a more permanent life somewhere else, or if I decide to sell the property, we'd give each other 6 months' notice. But Marlene, this house has been empty for half a year, and it feels wrong. Houses are meant to shelter people and pets and all the messiness of actual living." That evening, James drove Marlene and Fenwick to Sullivan's Island to see the property. The cottage was even more charming in person, small but efficiently designed, with hardwood floors that gleamed in the afternoon light and windows that framed views of maritime forest and distant ocean. There was a screened porch that would be perfect for morning coffee, a kitchen that was compact but complete, and a living room with a fireplace that Fenwick immediately claimed by curling up on the hearth. He likes it, James observed. He has good taste, Marlene replied, running her hand along the mantelpiece and imagining how it would look with books and plants and the small collection of meaningful objects she had managed to keep. There's something else, James said. The island has a community garden where my mother used to volunteer. They've been looking for someone to coordinate the winter growing season. It doesn't pay much, but it might be enough to supplement your income from the cafe. Standing in that cottage, with Fenwick exploring the sunny corners and the sound of wind through live oaks filtering through the windows, Marlene felt something she hadn't experienced since before losing everything, the sense of possibility rather than limitation. "When could I move in?" she asked. "Whenever you want. This weekend, if that works for you." That night, Marlene called Emma to share the news. "Mom, this sounds amazing!" Emma's excitement was audible even through the phone. "Send me pictures of everything. And you said there's room for me to visit? There's a second bedroom that would be perfect for you. James said you're welcome anytime, for as long as you want to stay. I'm telling Dad, I want to spend winter break with you. All 3 weeks. Emma, you don't have to..." "Mom, you found a house by the ocean where you can keep Fenwick and have a garden and space for me to visit. This is the best news I've gotten all year." The move happened with the kind of community support that still surprised Marlene, even after months of experiencing Charleston's particular brand of neighborly care. Mrs. Chen organized a group of volunteers to help pack and transport her belongings. Sarah brought homemade cookies and took charge of safely moving Marlene's jade plant. Maria arrived with a cat carrier and stern instructions about how to minimize Fenwick's stress during the transition. Even Mr. Rodriguez appeared, despite his mobility challenges, carrying a small potted herb garden as a housewarming gift. "Every home needs fresh basil," he declared. By Sunday afternoon, Marlene's few possessions had been transformed into the beginnings of a home. Her grandmother's recipe box sat on the kitchen counter. Her books filled a small bookshelf James had left behind. Emma's soccer trophy occupied a place of honor on the mantelpiece, beside a framed photograph of Fenwick on the day they first met. Fenwick himself had adapted to the cottage with the confidence of someone who understood that this was meant to be permanent. He had already identified the best sunny spots for napping, investigated every corner for security purposes, and established a routine of morning porch surveillance that made him look like a small, furry sentinel guarding their new domain. That evening, as Marlene sat on the front porch swing with Fenwick, curled in her lap, and the sound of ocean waves audible in the distance, she called Emma again. "I'm here," she said, when Emma answered. "We're really here, and it's perfect." "Tell me everything," Emma said. "I want to hear about every single detail." So Marlene did. She described the way the light changed throughout the day, painting the cottage walls in shifting shades of gold and blue. She talked about the garden plot she would tend, the morning walks she and Fenwick would take on the beach, the community of island residents who had already welcomed them with the easy warmth of people who understood that every newcomer enriched the whole. "And the best part," she finished, "is that there's room for you not just to visit, but to belong here too if you want." "I do want," Emma said quietly. "I want that so much, Mom." After they hung up, Marlene remained on the porch swing, watching the last light fade from the sky and listening to the night sounds of the maritime forest. Fenwick had moved to stretch across her lap in the possessive way he had when he wanted to ensure she couldn't leave without disturbing him. "You knew," she told him. "Somehow you knew this was where we were supposed to end up." He purred in response, and the sound blended with the whisper of wind through Spanish moss and the distant rhythm of waves on sand. 6 months ago, Marlene Whitford had been a woman running from her past, desperate to avoid being seen or known or needed by anyone. She had been convinced that her life was over, that the best she could hope for was to survive invisibly until she could figure out how to become someone worth knowing again. But Fenwick had seen something different. From that very first morning on the corner, when he had looked at her with those amber eyes and decided she was worth waiting for, he had understood what she had forgotten, that healing doesn't happen in isolation, that love is not a luxury but a necessity, that home is not about the size of your house or the balance in your bank account, but about the connections you build and maintain with other living things. Now, sitting in a cottage by the ocean with a cat who had chosen her and a daughter who wanted to spend winter break learning to tend a garden together, Marlene understood that she had never actually lost everything. She had lost some things, money and status, and the illusion of security that comes with material wealth. But she had not lost her capacity for love, for service, for building meaningful connections with other people. She had not lost her ability to create a home from whatever materials were available. She had simply forgotten these capabilities until Fennec reminded her. Tomorrow she would start her new job coordinating the island's winter garden. Next week, she would join the beach conservation group that James had mentioned. In 3 weeks, Emma would arrive for winter break, and they would decorate their first Christmas tree together in 4 years. But tonight, she simply sat on the porch swing with Fennec purring against her heart, watching stars appear one by one over the ocean, and marveling at how a chance encounter with a stray cat had taught her the most important lesson of her life, that running from the past is exhausting, but walking toward the future, even when you can't see where you're going, is the only way to discover where you truly belong. The woman who had spent months avoiding eye contact and hurrying past every corner was gone. In her place was someone who understood that the best journeys begin not with a destination in mind, but with the willingness to follow wherever love leads. And Fennec, wise beyond his years and patient beyond measure, had been the perfect guide for such a journey. As the last light faded from the sky and the cottage settled into peaceful silence around them, Marlene whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." Whether she was thanking Fennec, or the universe, or simply the mysterious force that brings the right souls together at exactly the right moment, didn't really matter. What mattered was that she was home. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest acts of trust. A woman extends her hand to a stray cat, and in that gesture rediscovers her capacity for love. A cat chooses to stay and teaches a human how to build a life worth living. In a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable, these quiet connections remind us that we are never as alone as we think, never as lost as we fear, and never too broken to begin again. All we need is the courage to stop running long enough for love to catch up with us, and the wisdom to recognize it when it arrives, even if it comes in an unexpected form, waiting patiently on a familiar corner.